For most children, Christmas is a celebration worth looking forward to. For 13-year-old Evan, it was something to fear. Evan still remembered his 7th Christmas Eve clearly, an evening that he, like most children, had been looking forward to for a long time. The next morning, he'd get up early and open all of his presents, eager to see what surprises Santa had left him. Evan imagined the restless night ahead and thought, if he listened hard, he might be able to hear Santa come down the chimney. But this Christmas Eve didn't all go to plan. It wasn't long before Evan's excitement gave way to horror. Mum had insisted that Santa wouldn't come if Evan stayed up late, and she just began sending him off to bed when Evan was distracted by a loud, muffled thump on the roof. It seemed to be coming directly above the fireplace. Was it now that Santa had decided to make an appearance? Ash was falling from the nooks and crannies of the chimney to the bottom of the fireplace, sending out charcoal smoke and a burnt smell. Something, someone, had to be disturbing the ash. Evan was alone. Who else went down the chimney at this time on Christmas Eve? The chimney rattled, and a deep, rolling voice hit the air. Santa's famous "Ho, ho, ho" echoed down the chimney as Evan watched in delight. Things were silent for a moment. Evan's mother stood behind him, watching. Then arose the biggest clatter yet. There was an explosion of greyish smoke as mountains of ash fell to the bottom of the fireplace. The fireplace shook as if there was a sudden earthquake. Then, amidst the greyness, there was a flash of red and a tremendous thump. Had Santa made it? Evan rushed forward, unable to stop himself. He felt a flare of excitement, but Mum was the first to the chimney. Evan tried to remember the last time his mother had expressed excitement, and couldn't. Then, the smoke cleared, and the fallen Santa came into view. He didn't have quite the belly that Evan had expected, but this was the least of his observations. Evan gasped as he saw that Santa's beard had appeared to slide off during his fall. But there was no blood. The only blood came from Santa's head, and it was just a trickle. The bad thing was that the trickle of blood was coming from what looked like a big dent in Santa's head. Evan frowned. Santa couldn't die. He was too good for that. He couldn't die. Not now. So had someone played a trick on him? Evan glanced at the beard that had appeared to slide down Santa's face. Beards didn't move like that, at least not without there being blood. So then, if it wasn't a real beard, it had to be a fake one. But if that was a fake beard, then Santa's suit was also a fake suit. This wasn't the real Santa. This was Santa in disguise. Evan glanced once more at the fake Santa's exposed features, trying to figure out who this person could be, and made sense of the face that seemed so familiar to him. He realised, for the first time, that Mum had never been excited. Instead, she'd rushed to the fake Santa's body in grief. Sobs racked her body, her tears dripping on the fake Santa's suit. Evan stood, dumbfounded, and choked out one word. "Dad?" Evan woke up in a cold sweat, bolting upright into a sitting position He glanced at his watch and read the time, 2:19 a.m. Before the light on his watch went off, he read the date. December 20th. Only 5 more days until Christmas. Once upon a time, Evan would have been happy about this. But now, he wished that Christmas never came. It was the same dream again, accurate in every detail. That evening was exactly how it had been in the dream. It never ceased to amaze him how vivid these dreams were. They got right down to the core and forced Evan to relive the worst moment in his life. Those goddamn nightmares. They got worse around Christmas. He would dream of that fateful evening his father slipped and fell down the chimney, smashing his skull in on the way down. Or he'd dream of those claws, those razor-sharp strips of polished bone, weapons that could slice through him like butter if they gave so much as a flick. Most kids grew out of their belief in Santa, came to accept that Santa was just another myth made up to make children happy. But Evan hadn't grown out of it. He'd been jolted out of it, his belief shattered with the tragic death of his father. He'd only been trying to surprise Evan, but he'd done so much more than that. He had bent Evan beyond repair. And every Christmas, he'd be haunted by Santa Claus. Evan was convinced that Santa Claus was some kind of demon in humanoid form. He was definitely not human. He was a supernatural entity of sorts. But he'd always thought of him as a demon. Santa Claus had been in Evan's life ever since his father died. And though he was mostly absent during the year, he'd come back around November, maybe late October. When it became nearer to Christmas, well, he would become more persistent then. There were the nightmares, for one thing, and the visions. And Evan had no shortage of seizures around Christmas time, when Santa Claus was at his worst. Sometimes, Evan had panic attacks that seemed to come from nowhere, and there was no doubt who'd caused them. Evan was no stranger to bullying at school because of his seizures and his strong dislike for Christmas. Santa Claus had taken its toll on Evan. He knew that Santa Claus had, in some way, been triggered by his father's death. Sometimes, he believed that Santa Claus was actually his father's ghost, turned evil in the existence of the afterlife. Evan wasn't one to believe in the supernatural, but Santa Claus had changed his mind about a lot of things. After a while, he'd been forced to accept that Santa Claus was always going to come back. Even if Evan grew out of his own personal dislike for Christmas, he'd never have a joyful Christmas ever again. It was this holiday that had caused his father's death. It was Christmas that had caused Santa Claus to come. Evan's head flopped back on his pillow. School had finished weeks before, but he was still dreading the next day, and every day to come until Christmas. What Evan was looking forward to the most was the absence of this demon. He'd hang around for a bit after Christmas, and then he'd slowly fade away. And Evan would be free of his presence between February and November. Then he could forget about Christmas, pretend it never existed. But no matter what, Santa Claus would always come back. And Evan was sure he would never be free of his demonic existence again. Evan woke early and rolled out of bed, opening his laptop without bothering to draw the curtains or turn on the light. He wanted to go online, play some games, do anything to take his mind off of Christmas, and, more importantly, Santa Claus. It was an hour or two before Evan sat down to a lazy breakfast of cornflakes, by which time Evan's mother had gotten out of bed. Mum had shut herself out of society a while after she unexpectedly became a widow, developing a strong case of depression. Eventually, she'd come to terms with her husband's death and became a more loving mother to Evan than ever. But she still had her bad days. Sometimes, Evan wondered whether Santa Claus was in her mind too. They both supported each other a lot, but Evan couldn't help but feel that the house was lonely every once in a while. He'd told his mum about Santa Claus for the first few years after his father's death. But then, he decided to pretend that he'd outgrown it. He didn't want to put extra weight on her shoulders, and the last thing he wanted was to make it seem like he was a child. But he couldn't hide the seizures. He couldn't hide the fact that he was sometimes absorbed in a hallucination, often concerning this demon. His mum seemed to blame it on the trauma he'd received after his father's death. Sure, maybe not all kids would experience that type of trauma, but everyone's different, aren't they? Evan said good morning to Mum and continued to eat his cornflakes. The fireplace was directly to his right, and Evan thought he could catch a glimpse of red out of the corner of his eye. His head turned. Nothing. Paranoia. Or maybe Santa Claus was playing tricks on him. Either way, Evan didn't fancy seeing him in the flesh. He'd seen him already, 5 times to be exact, and he'd see him a 6th time. For every Christmas Eve at 8:13 p.m, the exact time his father had fallen, he appeared in the fireplace, and Evan was always there to watch him make an appearance. It was then that Evan decided that this year he was going to be prepared. It would be no different to any other year. Santa Claus would appear in the fireplace at exactly the same time as he had the year before, and the year before that, and the year before that year. Mum was never around. She always went to bed early on Christmas Eve, or stayed in bed the entire day. This time, Evan wouldn't just be watching Santa Claus. He'd destroy him once and for all. Why hadn't he thought of it before? That day, Evan confined himself to the safety of his home, or, more specifically, his bedroom. He distracted himself with computer games and other activities, while all the time planning how he was going to get rid of Santa Claus when he made an appearance. Before his father died, he had a hunting rifle that hung on a hook on the wall. After his death, it had been hidden away inside his wardrobe, which was, of course, in the bedroom that Mum slept in. A gun was Evan's closest shot, and it was the only thing he could think of that might kill him once and for all. What else was he supposed to do? Shout a few defiant words and attack Santa Claus with his bare hands? His dead father's old hunting rifle was the only gun he could get. The only problem was getting it out of the wardrobe without his mother catching him. And she was sure to get suspicious if she saw him taking a gun out of the wardrobe. This proved to be an easier task than he thought. When she went out to do some shopping, he went straight to the wardrobe doors and started burrowing through the clothes. It was then that he experienced the seizure. He'd just caught sight of the gun when a sudden jolt ran through his body. His muscles were paralyzed, his joints frozen in place. He was unable to do anything but stare helplessly as he fell backwards onto the wooden floor. Shadows danced in front of his eyes as the visions began. He saw his father, now an ash-covered skeleton wearing a Santa hat, leering down at him through empty eye sockets. He saw a Christmas tree decorated with bloodied limbs, organs, and what looked like unravelled intestines. He saw claws curling in front of his eyes, claws that would cut him in two if he did so much as blink. He came to just as he heard the car pulling into the driveway. Frantically, his eyes darted around, searching for the hunting rifle. Something thin and black poking out from a pile of clothes caught his eye. The rifle. He snatched it up and bolted towards his room, not remembering to close the wardrobe door. He just reached his bedroom when Mum opened the front door. It wasn't until his mother called out to him an hour or so later. "Evan, have you been through my wardrobe?" That Evan remembered that he'd neglected to close the door. Yeah," Evan replied, thinking quickly. "I was looking for a jacket. You know, since all my other ones are too small. It's pretty cold with the snow and all." Evan was proud his voice didn't so much as quiver. To his relief, she didn't pursue the subject any longer. In that one day, he experienced the seizure inside the wardrobe, frequent flashes of movement out of the corner of his eye, and a brief hallucination. Usually, it was worse around this time, but Evan had it lucky. The nightmares didn't improve that night. The next day, he realised he had no bullets for the rifle. He'd forgotten to find some in his panic to get out of the room. His mum didn't go out that day, but he decided to have a look through the wardrobe anyway, and if she asked, he'd make up the same lie as yesterday. After some serious rummaging, he found 3 stray bullets hidden in the corner of the wardrobe in a plastic casing. This time, he didn't forget to close the wardrobe door. The plan was looking successful. That day, Santa Claus talked to Evan. The words were spoken inside of his head, but he knew who they belonged to. He found he couldn't remember most of the speech afterwards, but he knew it had something to do with Evan's plan to kill him. Of course, Santa Claus could get inside Evan's head, so why shouldn't he be able to read Evan's thoughts? This is what he'd done. Still, Evan wasn't prepared to give up so quickly. That day, he might have seen a lot of things that weren't there, but he kept his thoughts on that loaded rifle. On December 22nd, he not only heard Santa Claus and experienced his visions, but he felt him on his own flesh. At one point, it felt like a cat was running its claws across his arm, but no one was there. Still, that didn't stop blood from flowing. When his mum asked him what had happened, he said that Stormo had scratched him. Evan had an old tabby cat called Stormo and was no stranger to his scratches. His mum didn't notice the seizures and hallucinations, simply because Evan confined himself to his room all day. It was a pitiful existence, but Evan knew he had to do it to avoid suspicion. His mum blamed it on what had happened with his father, relating it to past trauma, and as a consequence, feeling the need to shut himself away from what the experience related to: Christmas. Evan didn't have any problems with that. The 23rd passed quickly, but the 24th was the worst day he'd experienced so far. He spent much of his time being tormented by the demonic presence of Santa Claus, his frightening messages ringing in his ears. Once, Mum walked in the room while he was having a seizure on his bed, but was able to avoid suspicion by saying he was in the middle of a nightmare. Time dragged on, as Evan became more and more tormented. His mother went to bed early, as she normally did on Christmas Eve. This left him 2 more hours until the demon made an appearance. Every past year, he'd been at the fireplace at 8:13, but this was because Santa Claus had willed him to be there. He felt his legs move and had been unable to stop them. Santa Claus wanted Evan to be there, to see him in the flesh. This was why he'd made sure he had the rifle clutched tightly in his hands before the time came. Evan glanced at his watch nervously. No, he was past nervous. He was terrified. 8:13 came, and nothing happened. But at the 22nd mark, he felt his legs moving down the hallway towards the lounge. His hands opened the lounge door. He approached the fireplace. The curtains were drawn, the lights were out. It was dark, and Evan could see nothing but the silhouette of Santa Claus in the fireplace. He could see the outline of a Santa hat on his head, and he was no stranger to the claws that hung at the shadow's side. He felt the presence of the demon. He knew that he would soon be illuminated by a ghostly light, and Evan would be able to see him in the flesh. Then he would raise the gun, pull the trigger, and it would be over. Or so he hoped. Evan stood there for what seemed like forever. Then the empty, bleeding eye sockets came into view. That white, almost transparent skin. The sharp, bloodied set of teeth that showed from behind slimy lips. The tattered Santa suit, smeared with the blood of innocent victims. And worst of all, the long, knife-sharp set of claws hung at each side. Evan was terrified. He stood paralyzed with fear as Santa Claus grinned and raised his hands towards him. He was unable to move, unable to do anything but watch as the claws came closer and closer to reaching him. It was too late to shoot now. It was all over. But as Evan stood frozen, his muscles stiffened and his finger tightened around the trigger. There was a terrific bang and a blinding flash of light. Then the world faded to black. He woke to his mum shaking him frantically. He blinked, trying to figure out what had happened. Then he remembered. He'd killed Santa Claus. Evan was exhausted, but too happy to comment. His face broke into a smile. "I did it," he whispered. Mum looked concerned. You're not well, Evan. You're going to a doctor as soon as possible. I worry about you. I killed Santa Claus, Evan babbled, oblivious to his mother's concerns. He was overcome with the joy that the demon would no longer be in his life. I'm not just worried about you, Evan. I'm also angry with you, Mum said, her eyebrows knitting into a scowl. What have you done to the fireplace? It looks like something out of a horror movie. Evan frowned. I never did anything to the fireplace. She sighed. Then how do you explain that? She said, pointing. Evan twisted his head around to face the fireplace. Solid crimson letters had been written on the brick wall behind the fireplace. The paint looked fresh, and Evan could see it still trickling down the wall. But it wasn't paint, Evan realised, but blood. The message read, Ho, ho, ho. Through the blackened sky I creep. Your innocence stirs, a secret I shall keep. No jingling bells, but whispers of dread and fear. For I'm coming inside, and your end draws near.